Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see squares yet again. Thank you for joining on this makeup session for a conversation I'm very much looking forward to having. I want to start again. Unfortunately, this is similar to a point that I raised during our last session with a note of recognition that once again this week we have experienced the death of an unarmed Black man at the hands of police, and so wanted to extend my feelings and recognition of that loss, of the life of Mr. Patrick Lyoya. This is something that the consortium is talking about, how we are positioned to respond, but also want to extend my availability if anybody in this group is struggling with that loss, having feelings or thoughts. If you want somebody to listen or to empathize, I am happy to make myself available as someone who has sat through a lot of those feelings myself this week. I think it's important that we acknowledge that in this forum, because I'm not sure that you might not have other places to do that. So know that I'm happy to sit with you as you work through those feelings, and hopefully we are in a different position than some, as we are actively working to prevent that from happening in the future, but that does not prevent the loss of life that we are now mourning. On a different note, I want to kind of an awkward transition, I'm going to name that, but wanted to once again remind folks to please complete the spreadsheet for final assignments. I will be distributing invitations early next week based off of what is in that spreadsheet. Invitations will be shared to the entire group. I recognize not everyone will be able to attend each of those sessions, but as your schedule permits, please try to pop in to hear from the experience and the lessons learned from the rest of the cohort. Recognizing we haven't had a ton of time to talk about what those final presentations look like, just wanted to reiterate, I'm expecting perhaps 5 to 7 minutes of an overview of what you have learned, what you've taken away from both working within the consortium as well as from your research, key lessons that you think it would be important for people in other jurisdictions to recognize, to learn from. Are there any questions about how we'll be using that time? Oh, okay. Again, I'm happy to address any offline if you feel more comfortable in reaching out to me directly. Great. Well, as we met just last week, that's really the only announcement that I wanted to bring. And now I am honored to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, who is a nationally recognized expert in police community relations and an authority on urban policing. Dr. Boyd currently serves as the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and is the former director of the Center for Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven. He is also the founder and president of Wren's Consulting and is a truly captivating speaker. And we're so privileged to have him with us today to talk about an issue very close to my heart and one that I know a number of you have expressed a great deal of interest in, that of police training. So Dr. Boyd, thank you for joining us on this holy day for so many different faiths. I hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for those of you joining us. I know it's Good Friday and people are doing things with their family, but thank you for taking time to be here. Let me just add one correction to my bio. I am no longer the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I actually stepped down this past fall. And the reason that I did, because what I think I'm supposed to do, when people realize self-actualization, what you're supposed to be doing, I realized that doing the DEI stuff at the university level was important. But for me, training the police, building bridges between the police and communities of color, for me, that's a calling. So I talked to my president, I stepped away and I said, based on my self-actualization, I need to be out in the community, because if we don't get this right, people are dying. And I didn't think I could affect change sitting in an office for 50 hours a week. So now I'm a distinguished professor of community policing at the University of New Haven. So thank you. Let me give you just a little tiny bit of my background. I spent 14 and a half years as a sheriff's deputy in Boston, and that transformed the way I started teaching. This is my 22nd year as a university professor. So I've gone from an assistant professor to department chair to a dean. I spent 2 years in the provost's office, vice president, but now I'm doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing. I've got a company called Renz Consulting, LLC, and we've been in operation for about 11 years. And there are 13 of us. Four or five are either sitting or current police chiefs. We have 3 attorneys and a bunch of PhDs. And ultimately, what we do is try to build bridges. And we get called into police departments to do after incident reports sometimes. But a lot of times we get called in when there are major issues. So we were in Ferguson on day 4. We were in Baltimore on day 3. We were in Dallas. We were in Tulsa. We were in Baton Rouge. So a lot of times it's our job to get really disgruntled cops and really pissed off community members to sit down to see if there's a pathway forward. So during the George Floyd kind of, pandemic lockdown, and you guys remember that 2 weeks to flatten the curve that lasted 18 months? Well, as we were locked out of our universities, we spent a lot of time on Zoom rethinking the training that we do. So we just started to push out a lot of cultural competence training, because one of the problems that I think I see is a lot of police officers don't understand what's going on in the community. They don't understand community trauma. They have no idea about vicarious trauma. They know zero about racial battle fatigue. But also, a lot of the officers are dealing with trauma that they've not dealt with. So we do this 8-hour session on trauma-informed policing. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes giving you an overview of an 8-hour training that I do, just so you can kind of see some of the things that we introduce and some of the stuff that we try to get officers to understand. And then I'm going to stop and then open it up for Q&A. So let me at least start sharing my screen. On occasion, there are going to be some of the slides that I will read to you, mostly for effect. Not that I don't think you can read the slides that are going to be before you, but for effect, I'm going to read some of the slides. So ultimately, what we talk about is community trauma and policing, because there's a real disconnect between the police and communities of color, and have been for a really long time. I like to start at the beginning. Let's go all the way back. When I trained police officers, the first question I asked them, what is justice? Define justice for me. And I go through the room and I get different officers, making different comments or saying different things. And a lot of people scratching their head and hemming and hawing, because we don't teach the police about justice. We teach them about laws. We teach them about enforcement. We teach them reactive practices, but we don't teach them about the concept of justice. And if we can get the police to stop being reactive beings and start being critical thinking people, then I think that'll help with part of the problem. So I offer a solution, and I offer a definition. I say, in one sense, justice is the ethical and philosophical premise, the idea that people should be treated fairly, properly, and reasonably by the law and those that carry out the law. And to me, that's not a big stretch. People being treated fairly, properly, and reasonably. And here's part of the pushback. People say that they should be treated fairly, properly, and reasonably by the police, by the court system, by corrections, but elected officials tend to get a pass. And I push back because there's a lot of laws that on face value may seem okay, but have discriminatory outcomes. So we need to push back because the law needs to treat people fairly as well. So then I ask, when you look at what justice is it when similarly situated people receive similar outcomes? Is justice due process? is justice, fair outcome? And we spend almost an hour with an 8-hour policing session talking about concepts of justice, because I can't let them move on to the next phase until they at least understand justice and their role in maintaining justice. And I tend not to use the term law enforcement because law enforcement is a reactive term. We acknowledge that upwards of 80% of what the police do is reactive. I try to get them to talk about being police officers, which is service-oriented, which is more proactive. If we can get the police to do a paradigm shift in their head about what they're supposed to do, I think that's going to help move forward. Then I talk about community policing. And when I go into a police department and the chief inevitably will say, oh yeah, community policing, we got it. You know, I've got 10 officers assigned to community policing, so we're good. What you're telling me is if you have 10 officers assigned to community policing, the rest of your department isn't. And that to me is problematic as well. Because when we talk about community policing, it's not a strategy. It's not something that people are supposed to be doing. Community policing is a philosophy. And ultimately, it's about partnership and problem solving. And when I talk to police departments, they tell me they're doing partnerships, but they're not. They're doing engagement because they spend a lot of time doing things for communities or doing things to communities, but they don't spend time doing things with communities. And in order for it to be a true partnership, the community has to have choice and voice. Anything short of that is just simple engagement. And we want engagement as well, but we think the police should raise to a higher standard. We want people to focus on the philosophy of community policing because we want them to address the immediate issues. When you talk about the stuff that's happening in society, most people are concerned with fear of crime. If we can deal with social disorder and we can deal with fear of crime, that's the first step in helping the relationship between the police and the community, particularly communities of color. So when we talk about community policing, ultimately it's about trust. And if you think about trust, and this is the way I explain it to the police, and I'll give you kind of the Reader's Digest version of it. So think about a giant bucket. And every day, every transaction, it's like putting a drop of water into that bucket. But if there's enough of you doing good deeds every single day, then 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 30 drops of water get into the bucket. And before you know it, the bucket is halfway full. The problem comes one misdeed, one thing like happened in Grand Rapids, or that happened in Minneapolis, or that happened in Louisville. You know, one misdeed is like kicking over the bucket and pouring out all of that trust. So now you've got to set the bucket back up again and go through the long and arduous process of rebuilding trust in the community. Trust between the police and the communities that they serve is crucial in a democracy. We cannot move forward without trust. That's the key to the stability of our communities. Trust is the key to the integrity of our criminal justice system and also the safe and effective delivery of policing or of public safety services. Without trust, everything else falls apart. And I try to get the police to understand your number one priority is building trust within the community. Because community policing is not a philosophy. I'm sorry, it's not a strategy. It's not something that you do. It's not something that you assign. Community policing is a philosophy. It has to be the thread woven into the very fabric of your department. And if it's not, that's why you're starting to have problems. I try to get the police to understand that there's a lot of trauma in the community. There's a lot of people out there that dislike you, not because of anything that you personally have done. Because when I was on the job in Boston, what feels like 100 years ago now, when the Rodney King beating happened, prior to that, I would drive through the neighborhood, people would wave at me, folks would stop and talk to me. But right after the Rodney King beating, like within days, I'm going through and I'm waving, people aren't waving back. And on occasion, I'd wave at people and they'd give me the finger and I go, what's the deal? What changed? And they said to me, Lorenzo, I've seen what you people did to Rodney King. And the fact that I'm in Boston, 3,000 miles away, I took the hit as a good officer. I took the hit for stupid stuff that bad officers were doing. And there's a lot of trauma in communities because people of color, particularly, every single day, they see either on the local news, they see it on the national news, they see it in social media, people of color being harmed by people in uniform. And that weighs in on people's psyche all the time. And trauma is subjective. Everybody deals with trauma differently. Everyone experiences trauma differently. And I try to get the police to understand that trauma is not the event itself. Trauma is your interpretation. Trauma is how you interpret the event. And different people, based on their experiences, are going to deal with different levels of trauma. And the one constant is that a lot of the harm that happened were perpetrated by people that dress like you. And to use the adage that the police tend to use, you may not be the person that caused the trauma, but based on how you're dressed, you fit the description. And there's a lot of people that are triggered because of the uniform, because they see people dressed in uniform causing harm to people of color. And that's problematic because their perception ultimately becomes their reality. And I try to get people to understand how pervasive trauma is. Trauma is prolific in our communities. And it's not just limited to criminal victimizations. I tell them that 70% of adults in the United States have experienced some type of traumatic event in their life. So based on our population, you're talking over 220 million people have faced some level of trauma. And when we talk about it, just so we can be on the same page, not that I'm reverting back to Professorship 101, but the word trauma comes from the Greek word to wound. Trauma is a wounding. It's harm that's caused. It evolved over the years to encompass both physical and emotional wounds. And if we ignore that, we do it to our own detriment. When we look at trauma, most of the time, trauma is manifest behaviorally. And there's a lot of coping mechanisms. We can't tell somebody how they're supposed to adapt to levels of trauma. Because when we see people, when we think to ourselves, why are you doing that? What's your problem? Why would you do this? What we don't realize sometimes, what we view as a problem may actually be somebody else's coping mechanism. For them, it may be their solution. And when people are traumatized, one of the things that we start to see is levels of self-medication, engaging in risky behavior, overly aggressive behavior. Sometimes people that are trying to avoid being traumatized, they'll strike out first to avoid being the victim of things. So trauma manifests itself in different ways, and we need the police to be able to understand what this behavior is. We need the police to be able to interpret some of the things that are going on. Part of the problem is there's a lot of gaslighting going on. People not acknowledging some of the issues that are going on, telling them that's not a problem or it didn't really happen. So I spend a lot of time with the police trying to get them to understand the gaslighting of Black America. Because a lot of the trauma that Black America goes through, a lot of police officers or some people in the white community try to say these aren't real issues or these issues aren't real problems. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Because we say to people, okay, I get it, bad stuff happened, let's move forward. We can't just move forward and heal, because the premise of all I do in Renz Consulting is a two-part process. It's first diagnostic, then it's prescriptive. Everybody says, well, let's just move on. Let's begin to heal. That's the prescriptive part. I can't start to heal unless we know what the problem is. If you go into your doctor's office and said, look, I don't feel well at all, and then they have the receptionist give you a prescription, go ahead, take this. You're gonna say, wait a minute, aren't you gonna examine me? Aren't you gonna diagnose what the problem is before you give me a prescription? That's what we have to do in the relationships between the police and the Black community. We've got to first diagnose and acknowledge the pain. We've got to acknowledge the harm that was done. Once there's a real acknowledgement, then at that point, we can become prescriptive and move forward and stop gaslighting Black America, because that's making it worse. Because you're telling us that we've got to ignore 246 years of slavery. We're going to ignore 400 years of oppression. But today, on this date, on the 15th of April of 2022, today, I'm supposed to just move on as though the stuff in the past didn't happen. We're going to ignore 246 years of slavery. We're going to totally discount Jim Crow. We're going to totally forget about the Black codes. We're going to forget about slave codes. We're going to just totally eliminate the fact that segregation happened for multiple generations. We're not going to talk about that because people are saying, you want to get over it. People are saying, we can't talk about this because it's making me uncomfortable. Your pain, your trauma is making me uncomfortable. So much so that we decided we're going to legislate against it. We're going to put a label on it and we're going to call it something different. All of a sudden now, when you want to talk about history, we're going to call it critical race theory. And we're going to legislate that you now can't talk about it and you can't teach it. And the thing that I say is, how awful is your history that you need to legislate to keep it secret? So if you want, and I keep saying, critical race theory is something that's typically taught on L2s or L3s in law school. Clearly, we're not teaching little Billy in fourth grade critical race theory. Stop it. That's not at all what it is. And people want to call this critical race theory. And I say, if you want, you can call it that, but we can also call it by its other name, actual American history. So the fact that you want to whitewash, I chose the word on purpose, you want to whitewash American history, but yet you don't understand why there's still a disconnect between the police and communities of color, because you're gaslighting the Black community, and that's problematic. But in America, there are some things that we're forced to forget, but other things we can never forget. For instance, one day, one event that happened on one day in history, September 11th, that one day in history, never forget. 246 years of slavery, sweep it under the rug. The Alamo, it happened over 13 days. And the rally call is, remember the Alamo. When we talk about the Confederacy, at what point do we erect statues for the losing side? What is this, middle school soccer? Everybody gets a trophy for participating? That's problematic. And the rally cry from America is always, we will never forget, unless it's your pain. We're gonna remember the stuff that we do, but we're gonna discount you because we're othering a lot of people of color and we don't understand why there's such a disconnect. So in 2016, there was a meeting in San Diego, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the president at the time, Terry Cunningham, who happened to be at the time the police chief in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And as the headline from the Washington Post said, he actually apologized to the Black community for the historic mistreatment at the hands of policing. Remember, it has to be diagnostic, then prescriptive. This is part of the diagnostic part. We're acknowledging that bad stuff happened. I personally probably didn't do it, but my profession did. And I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts from his speech because I think it's really important to hear. He says, over the past events over the past several years have caused many to question the actions of our officers and has tragically undermined the trust that the public must and should have in their police departments. He goes on to say that the history of this profession is replete with examples of bravery, self-sacrifice, and service to the community. Here's the part that I like, and I agree with this. At its core, policing is a noble profession. For 12 and a half years of my life, it was a noble profession. There's a lot of people out there in policing that are still trying to do the right thing. They're trying to do a good job. He goes on to say, at the same time, it's also clear that the history of policing has also had dark periods. This dark side of our shared history has created a multi-generational, almost inherited mistrust between many communities of color and their police departments. For our part, the first part in this process is for law enforcement, for policing, for the International Association of Chiefs of Police to acknowledge and apologize. Again, that's the diagnostic part. We're acknowledging that bad stuff happened. I didn't do it. I wasn't there when slavery happened. I wasn't part of Jim Crow. I wasn't part of segregation, but I do understand that the symbolism of my job now reflects that. And for that, I apologize for the stuff that happened in the past. And from today forward, now let's try to build something going forward. Because first we acknowledge the negative stuff that happened. And at this conference, a significant number, probably 20% of the police chiefs got up and walked away. They just walked out right in the middle of it. For those of us that stayed, Terry Cunningham got a standing ovation because everybody understands that this is the pathway forward. And when I talk to the police about issues of trauma, there's a lot of officers that are out there trying to do the right thing. And I tell them, a lot of what people are feeling, it's not about you. You weren't in Minneapolis in 2020. You weren't in Louisville when the no-knock warrant happened with Breonna Taylor. You weren't in Brunswick, Georgia. You know, this isn't about you. And I try to explain to them that given the complexities of vicarious trauma, it's really not uncommon for people to project their negative feelings, their dislike, their disdain, their hatred onto people who trigger these negative memories. Sometimes I tell them it's not about you, but you do fit the description. So you have a job to do, police. You have to meet people where they are. You have to help bridge the gap. You have to try to understand the stuff that people are going through. It means intentionally listening to people, trying to understand their values, trying to understand their needs, trying to figure out their desires, and trying to understand their trauma responses. Because sometimes what you see, what you view, what you think is in front of you is not at all what you're seeing. Sometimes it's literally something else. A lot of times people don't know how to manifest their feelings. A lot of times people don't know how to express what they're feeling. And if I were to go through the room right now and ask people, explain to me your emotion, I would guess half of you would say, oh, I'm fine. Being fine is actually not an emotion. So I tell the police sometimes what you perceive as anger may actually be frustration, it may be fear, it may be grief, it may be trauma responses, but you interpret it as anger, so therefore you want to increase levels of force. And that's problematic. We want the police to understand that there's vicarious trauma. We want the police to take a step back and listen to people, try to figure out what's going on with people. Because if we drill down to the basics, the bottom line is people just want to be seen and they want to be heard. That's not hard. That's not a very high bar. People want to be seen, they want to be heard. People want their experiences validated, they want their feelings validated, they want their thoughts validated. And the key is listening with empathy, trying to understand what they're going through, trying to put yourself in their place. That becomes really important. When we talk about sympathy, it involves understanding from your own perspective. And for me, when people told me they lost a loved one, I would put my hand over my heart and I'd kind of bow my head and say, you have my deepest sympathies. What that means is I've not really had anybody close to me die, but for you, it must suck that somebody died and I wish you didn't have to go through that. That's what sympathy is. Empathy is a little different because 4 years ago, I lost my father and I went through the stages of grief and I understood the pain. So at every single point after that in the last 4 years, when somebody told me they had a death in the family, I can empathize now because I can put myself in their shoes. I understand your pain. I literally understand what you're going through. And that's the difference between sympathy and empathy. And when we talk about that, we generally say to people, walk a mile in my shoes. And we've all used that. But that's not the whole story. Because in order for you to walk in somebody else's shoes, you've got to take your own shoes off first. You've got to literally put yourself in their space. And if you're going to walk in my shoes, you've got to take your shoes off. You can't put your size 10 Nikes into my size 11 Adidas. That doesn't work. Once you take your shoes off, then you can kind of put your feet into my shoes. So what does that mean? That means suspending your beliefs, your value system, your attitudes, because your experiences are real, but they're your experiences. And when you show up, how you present may be very different. And when I come to the table, I come as a highly educated, African-American, cisgendered, heterosexual, middle-class male. And the people that I'm dealing with may not check all of those boxes, or they may not check any of those boxes. So my job is to let go some of the biases that I have, let go of some of the experiences to try to completely and honestly understand somebody else's position. And this is what I bring to the police. Police are too reactive. I try to get them to be a little more proactive, to try to police with levels of empathy. And that's hard. And I push them to a document. The final report on 21st century policing that was impaneled under President Obama. And for whatever reason, the president that came after that wanted to undo everything that President Obama did. And this final report was the thing that ushered policing into the 21st century. And there are 6 pillars: building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology, social media, community policing, crime reduction, training and education, officer wellness and safety. Pillar 1 and Pillar 6 are the bookends that hold everything else together. And for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to introduce you to 3 of the pillars real quick. Pillar number 1 says that building trust and nurturing legitimacy is the foundational principle behind the inquiry into the nature of the relationship between the police and the communities that they serve. People are more likely to obey the law when they believe that those that are enforcing it have the legitimate authority to tell them what to do. The thing that I like here is the B clause. The public confers legitimacy only on those that they believe are acting in procedurally just ways. Procedural justice is really important, how you treat people. There's a lot of folks that talk about process versus outcome. Procedural justice is process. How you treat people does actually matter. Pillar 4 talks about community policing. It says you've got to build a positive relationship with members of the community. It's not a strategy, it's a philosophy that includes partnership and problem solving. Police intervention must be implemented with policies that are rooted in procedural justice. How you treat people does really matter. And the last one, Pillar 6, officer wellness and safety. A lot of people want to talk about officer safety. We've done a good job. And last year was among the safest year for police in a generation. You'd have to go back to the Nixon administration to find police officers that were felonious killed in lower numbers. So last year in 2021, the number one killer of police was COVID. Number two was suicide, but we don't talk about that. Number three, motor vehicle death. And number four is the bad guy. You have to go all the way down to number four to find people feloniously killed. But the thing that we don't talk about is officer suicide. From 2019 into 2020, the New York City Police Department averaged one suicide per month. They certainly didn't average one homicide per month. We don't spend enough time allowing police officers to get help because the trauma that they feel, whether it's post-traumatic, whether it's vicarious trauma, whether it's secondary trauma, they don't spend a lot of time dealing with that. And if they're not right, if police officers are broken, to borrow a term, they're not going to be able to effectively police the community. And we think that police are really tough and they can go through this, but let me tell you, the concept of the bulletproof cop, it doesn't exist. The officers that protect us may also need to be protected, particularly against things that are so incapacitating, like physical, mental, and emotional health problems. I would argue that that's even more important to deal with that than the hazards of the job. Because when police officers have undealt with trauma, they tend to have more problems, they tend to use more force, they tend to have more complaints against them. So I would argue that the police use of force is not the problem, it's symptomatic of larger problems. And if we address those larger problems, then the negative policing tends to take care of itself. And I tell folks, understand cross-cultural communication, use gender-neutral terms, use inclusive language. Be aware of your nonverbal cues. If you talk to a police officer and they cross their arms across their chest and blade their body away from you, they're telling you that they're not listening or they're not believing. Be aware of nonverbal cues. Also, we need to acknowledge trust issues because of the history of the negative relationship between the police and communities of color. Also, avoid using generational and cultural references. One of the terms that you can use that set people off, you people. Once you start a sentence with you people, you've lost. Anything that you started to build, you've automatically lost. And I tell the police, stop taking things personally. Just listen to the community members. Because if you listen, people will tell you how they want to be policed. People will tell you the most effective way to police their communities. But unfortunately, the police run in with this thought that every call could be your last call and the people are against you and it's us versus them. The way we train the police is problematic. And the reason that I came a couple of minutes late, because here in Connecticut where I live, we were dealing with police training issues in our statewide police academies. And I'm trying to push cultural competence. Because here in Connecticut, we have 119 hours that the police go through the police academy, 4 hours of that, 1,119 hours. So 1,100 hours police training, 4 hours cultural competence. They go through between 80 and 100 hours using a firearm. They do between 60 and 80 hours driving the vehicle. And I would argue that people need cross-cultural communication way more than they need a firearm, because a significant number of officers go their whole career without firing their weapon. But you're not going to go through one day without dealing with community members. If we can rethink policing and police training, that's going to be the thing that helps us move forward. And I will take questions if anybody has questions. And I know, I apologize. I just dumped a ton of information on you in 25 minutes. I try to wrap up an 8-hour training and drop it, but I just want you to understand some of the things that we do in our company. And we work with police departments around the country. And in a typical non-COVID year, we do about 350 hours of training with police departments around the country. And that looks like kind of running an 8-week police academy. So we spend a lot of time in front of a lot of officers. Thanks.
Dr. Boyd, thank you. Just, yes, so much information, but of so much value to us. So thank you for all of that. I want to open it to the floor for questions, but while you're thinking of those, the one that's most pressing to me is, can you talk a little bit more about the audience that is in receipt of this training program?
So typically when I go in because of one of three reasons. One, because things have gone so horribly wrong that the state or the courts are mandating you need to do this training. The second time I go in is for an after incident report. Something happened in the department, but it may not be department wide, and we need to get a handle on this. And the third situation is there's a lot of police chiefs that say we're doing the right thing, but I see the landscape out there. I understand what's going on. We don't want to be Minneapolis. We don't want to be Louisville. So what can you do to bring us to the point where we understand our communities so our officers don't do these stupid things? And when I first walk in, as you can imagine, people are pretty pissed off. You know, I tell them my policing background and they go, okay, well, at least he's done the job, maybe. But this black guy is going to come and tell us that I'm a racist. And what I do is I talk about terms of justice. I talk about terms of trauma. And once I get them to buy in, by the time I get to race, they're like, wait a minute, you tricked me into learning. You know, and that's kind of how I have to approach it. Because if I start off with, these are the racial elements you need to be aware of, they shut down. And I don't have the luxury of having police shut down. I need every single officer to be engaged every single time. But when we do this, it's not us talking at them. We bring in scenarios, we do role play, you know, we make it amazingly interactive.
That's exactly where I was going with that. So thank you, because there's so much value. And obviously, as the doctor, you have diagnosed the issue. And I guess my question is if there has been any appetite to more wholly embed the material that you are providing into the core curriculum that departments are in receipt of before they are entering the field.
The short answer is yes and no. There are some progressive chiefs that understand that this has a real value, but the vast majority of policing is pretty traditional. And they're going to say, well, he's going to want to bring in 16 hours. I don't have an extra 16 hours. My issue is hold your class 2 additional days. And then they say, well, wait a minute, you're not doing this for free, right? No, I've got to pay my people to fly out to wherever, put them up in hotels, feed them wherever. No, this is absolutely not free. And when a police chief tells me, I don't know that we can afford this, my answer is you can't afford not to do this, because whatever we're going to charge you is going to be so much less than the lawsuit that's going to come out when you pay people millions of dollars because your officers did something stupid. You can't afford not to do this. So it's just a matter of convincing legislators at the state level to force this into their post council, the Police Officer Standards and Training Council. Once they do that, then I think we're going to move in the right direction. But this is not a panacea. You know, you're a 22-year-old that grew up in a racist household, and every day at the dinner table, you hear negative things about people of color. Nothing in 16 hours of working with me is going to undo 22 years of Fox News blasting in your head, you know, at the dinner table. It's not a panacea. We're going from none to some, and then from some to more.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I'm also really grateful that you've touched on both the content of the training as well as the way in which to engage with your learners. That scenario-based training component is one that I have not seen much of in the academy environment, and is one that I know engages the brain in such a more realistic, well-rounded way that better allows those individuals to implement that learning when they go into the field. I want to turn the floor to others for Stephanie.
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. I really liked what you had to say about community policing as a philosophy rather than a policing strategy. A lot of the time in a class that I'm in right now, that is a seminar class, is spent discussing community policing with individuals who are in law enforcement. And it usually comes down to their statement that, and I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee, by the way. We are community policers. We have a foot patrol that patrols Magnolia, so that's our community policing, and we are community policers. So I wondered if you had suggestions on how to communicate, convey, or encourage departments to adopt that as a philosophy rather than thinking that it is simply a strategy that you can put a few officers on tasks and say that you are community policers.
That's a great question, Stephanie. And I never would have guessed that you're from the South. No accent at all.
Thanks. I don't think I have an accent at all.
So part of the problem with moving toward community policing, part of it is a numbers game. Most police departments that I talk to are understaffed. New Haven, Connecticut, they're 100 officers down. So it's hard to put people out to do community stuff when you've got calls backed up. And when I was in Boston, I worked 4 to midnight most of my shift, most of my career. And when I went out on a call, I knew once I got to the call, there were 2 other calls stacked waiting for me to get to. So I didn't have that extra time to talk to the grandmother and explain to her. I didn't have all this extra time to say, these are the resources in the community that you need to go to, because I don't know what those other 2 calls are. I don't know if somebody really needs me. So part of the problem is we can do community policing if we don't have calls backed up. The flip side of that coin is if you do a lot more community policing, you'll have a lot fewer calls that are going to be backed up. So it's a chicken versus egg thing. And even if you start off with some officers, and then move to more officers. And the problem, Stephanie, is policing is numbers driven. How many crimes were reported? How many arrests were made? You can't quantify the amount of crimes that you prevented because you spent 20 minutes talking to a kid about not joining a gang. And that's what's missed, because it's about, a tick sheet. I want to know, what did you do every hour, every half hour? How many cars did you stop? What did you do? As opposed to, I spent 4 hours in this fragile community. I don't use the term poor. I don't use the term ghetto. These communities are fragile. And if we want to fix a fragile community, deal with the levels of fragility by adding resource to them. Having a police officer in this community spending time talking to people is the thing that's going to help. And you can't quantify that. And one quick story. I spend a lot of my summers, now that I'm back on faculty and I get summers off again, I get to write and do stuff, but I donate, there's a bunch of us. There are 7 or 8 Black faculty members, because I read a story that said Black males are less likely to graduate from high school, but if they have 1 Black faculty member, it increases their chance for graduation by 50%. So I went to my university and I went to the Black folk and say, let's donate some of our time to, the K through 12 public school system. So I had every Tuesday and would helping them with math homework or whatever, and just helping them with life skills. And I said, let's talk about policing. And this one kid goes, I hate the police. And I said, how many of you don't like the police? And they were like, we didn't say don't like, we said hate. So I said, well, what did the police do to you? Well, they never did anything to me. Did they do something to anybody you know? Well, no. Do you know any cops? Any in your family? No. So I said, here's your homework assignment. Find a police officer in your neighborhood, go up to him and say hi. That's it. That's your homework assignment. Say hi to a cop. And they were like, that's stupid. I'm not going to do that. Well, if you don't do it, you don't get credit for this week's assignment. So they agreed. So I came back in the next week and I'm pulling out my laptop, just getting set up. And this kid goes, Dr. Boyd, can I go first? I go, sure, what's up? He says, I did what you told me to do. He said, there's this cop in my neighborhood. He's an old white cop with a big belly. And I went right in his face and I said, hi. He says, you're never going to guess what happened. I said, what happened? He said, the officer said hi to me. And he asked me how school was going. And then he started talking to me about basketball and we started talking sports. And this little kid who said he hated the police, he said, the police talked to me as if I were human or something. And that just blew these kids' mind. And I said, well, how do you feel about the police now? He said, I still hate the police, just not this officer. This officer's really cool. He's good. It's hard to hate up close. And I tell the police, you've got to build the bridge toward the community. But I tell community members, you have to build the bridge the other way toward the police. We've got to do this together.
Incredibly poignant.
I just dropped, by the way, I just dropped in the chat an article written about work that I'm doing up in the Adirondack region with a lot of the police departments up there. Because if you know nothing about way North Country, New York, there's next to zero diversity. So we're actually making headway up there for your leisure reading.
Molly, did I see your hand up?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Boyd. Thank you so
Hey,
much
Molly.
for speaking with us. It was just absolutely wonderful and educational, and you're such a good public speaker. I wish I could speak half as intelligently as you do.
Thank you so much.
But aside from that, my question is, what do you think is, I suppose, the part in your training where you see a light bulb go off in the officer's mind? Sometimes I feel like when I'm, talking to other students or professor, there's that like light bulb moment. And I'm just curious if you see that in officers, and if so, what part that is.
I do see it. And it's not when I talk to them about the stuff going on with community members, because they're disconnected from that. When I start talking to them about officer trauma and the stuff that they're going through and how their trauma is affecting other people, that's when they start to get it. Because my training is different, because typically most criminal justice training is outward training. We treat the police as a monolithic group and we train toward the community. Our training at Renz Consulting is the exact opposite. We do internal training. There's a lot of self-reflection. There's a lot of introspection. So it's not about what the community members do. It's how do you feel about it? You can't control other people's actions. You can control your own reactions. And part of the reason you have this negative reaction is because you've got unresolved trauma that you're dealing with. So we spend a lot of time talking about officer wellness. And it's funny because as we go through this, I try to just be disconnected, but it kind of brings up things in my past, either things that I may or may not have done based on statute of limitations, or things that I've seen or things that I've experienced. And it makes me kind of remember. So I know the people that are doing the job today, they're going through that as well. So the aha moment for most police are when we talk about the traumas they deal with and how their unresolved trauma means that they can never effectively police their communities.
Can I have a follow-up to that?
Absolutely.
I think that's really interesting. First of all, that, in order to present outwardly, you need to look inwardly. So I guess my next question to that would be, I know that there's like an uptick of mental health counseling and more focus towards certain precincts. But it seems like it's not enough. And so I guess my question to you is, what do you think the best method of mental health counseling for police officers is? Like, what I always think of is it should be mandatory therapy. But, I don't have any specialty to base that question
Well,
on.
Molly, again, diagnostic, then prescriptive. I'm not going to seek help if I don't think I'm broken. It's just making officers aware of some of the stuff that's going on. Sometimes you just want to talk. And I also remind them that the suicide rate for police is 3 times higher than the general public. The police are 300 times more likely to be alcoholic than the general public. The divorce rate for the general public is about 54%. It's approaching 70% for the police. If the average life expectancy for the normal American is 72 years old. It's about 60 for the police. So let's talk about officer wellness, because tough cops do ask for help. Because if you don't ask for help, your life expectancy is going to go down. So do you want to be around for your family, for your kids, for your grandkids? And we have to have these hard conversations, because a lot of people don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about suicide. And I always say, it's not about you. It's not about you, Molly, but can you just watch out for Stephanie to make sure Stephanie's okay? And can you just kind of keep an eye on Marissa and make sure Marissa's okay? And I tell the officers, pay attention to other people in your squad. And if they need help, let them tap out. And if I'm telling you that, Molly, you're also going to think, okay, it's okay for me to ask for help as well. And I think that's really crucial. Megan, I think I saw your hand up.
I did have my hand up. My question was more along the lines of just in general, when we have, or when I've had experiences having conversations, I actually have, I've had experience on both ends of the spectrum with police. I've had a traumatizing experience with police involving my brothers. And then I've also had, very pleasant, a lot more pleasant experiences with police officers, just as I've matriculated through college and through my master's program. But most of the conversations that we've had around like serious fatalities, especially in the African-American community, I feel like it becomes very much so like us versus them mentality. Like the police officers are like, well, it's one bad person. And it's like, okay, but at what point, I guess my question is because I do want to be, more proactive than reactive. Since you're kind of pushing that on police, I guess I can take that on myself. How do we start conversations around accountability, and not necessarily like we want you guys to recognize this wrong, but like how do we have these conversations of like, okay, this is what the situation was, and it's not an us versus them. This is a how can we address this in our community? Like even though what happened with Breonna Taylor didn't happen in California or in Louisiana, I'm currently in Louisiana. How can Louisiana look at that situation and learn instead of creating like an us versus them kind of dialogue? How do we turn that into a let's learn from it? Because I feel like whenever you bring up those types of things, it's like, well, and it's just like a gut reaction. Like we didn't do that. We didn't. And it's like, that's not what I'm not trying to start that conversation. I'm not blaming you for anything. I just want to learn as a group, as a community, like what can we do as citizens and what can you do as officers to say, okay, that's something that we can learn from. Like, how do we spark those kinds of conversations from that kind of angle without creating a space where it feels like it's like we're accusing you of, or accusing a department that had nothing to do or had no hand in that kind of behavior,
No, that's a good point. That's something, Megan, that a lot of people actually ask about. And I start off with, so we're familiar with the term white fragility, where the theory is that there's a lot of white folks who never had to deal with issues of race. They never were presented with it. So then when it is presented, they are uncomfortable and they don't want to deal with it. So if you can follow the logic, and I wrote about this, we just finished an intro to policing book that we wrote from a social justice perspective. If we can acknowledge that white fragility does exist, imagine how much more so blue fragility exists. Because we tend not to hold the police accountable for things. And when we do hold them accountable, they then feel victimized. Levels of accountability make them feel victimized because they are so used to privilege. And here's Boydism 101. There are some people that are so used to privilege that equality feels like oppression. So we need to go a little softer. And there's a lot of folks in the Black community, particularly where I'm from, that want me to go all Dave Chappelle on people. You're just racist, you're a bunch of... If I do that, everybody shuts down. So I need to kind of walk in a little more gingerly. And folks are telling me, you spend too much time caring about the feelings of the police when they're doing all these bad things. But you got to meet people where they are. The same way we're asking the police to understand and empathize with people, we need to empathize with them, because the vast majority of police, I believe, are law-abiding, God-fearing people that are trying to do the right thing and trying to do a really hard job. But there's a small number, I would put at about 10% that don't. And I was doing a talk for Mayor de Blasio's people in New York this past fall, and a grandmother came up to the mic and said, "You keep saying that most police officers are good." And I said, "That's true, that's what I believe." And she says, "Where are all these good officers when bad officers are doing bad things? And if they don't stop them, are they really good officers?" And I didn't say a word. I just stopped. I just stared at her for a while because I needed people to digest that question. Because it's funny to me when I deal with elected officials, when people come up with legislation and tell the police you have a duty to intervene, the whole job of policing is to intervene. That's kind of your job. So the fact that we then have to legislate that is problematic. And when I was in law school at Northeastern, I made it all the way to 2L and decided law school sucks, and I got a PhD instead. But we flew in a guy, Judge Posner, Ninth Circuit. He came in and he taught our con law class. And one of the things he said was, policing is the worst job in the world because the police have a fraction of a second to make a decision. And then the Supreme Court takes 2 years to decide 5-4 whether or not they were right. And again, I'm not a police apologist at all, but we also acknowledge that not everything is problematic and we have to have, the hard conversations. We have to start the conversations. And if I started with, "Megan, you people from Louisiana, I don't know what the heck," if I start like that, you automatically shut down on me. So if we can go in a little softer, and if we can start having conversations, and if we can find synergies between us, then that's a step in the right direction. I know time is going over, but I want to share one more thing with you that I think will help illustrate my point. When I talk to police officers and I tell them the stuff that's going on and the things that happen, ultimately they say, "Well, that's not me. I wasn't there with Breonna Taylor. I wasn't there, in Louisville. I wasn't in Minneapolis." And I tell them a story. I've got a grandson named Joe, 5 years old. We're out in the park throwing a ball around, and he saw a lady walk in with her dog. And as soon as my grandson saw the dog, he said, "Uh-oh." And he kind of ran behind me and hid. And the lady laughed and said, "It's okay, you can pet my dog." My grandson said, "No, thank you." And she goes, "No, he's a nice dog, you can pet him." My grandson said, "No, thank you, ma'am." And then she kneeled down directly in front of us with this little 2-month-old, cute, colored little dog. And she said to my grandson, "You can pet my dog. My dog doesn't bite." And my grandson stared at the dog and said, "The dog doesn't bite? But doesn't your dog have teeth?" That image changed the way I view police training. Because ultimately, the question is, how often do you need to see somebody get bit by a dog before you decide you don't want to play with dogs? Or how often do you have to get bit by a dog? Because people bring their perceptions with them. And I tell the police, you present one way, you may think you're officer friendly, but because of the trauma in the community, this is what we see. So the more we can get the police to understand the perspective of community members, the easier it's going to be to bridge that gap. How's that, Megan? Was that answer for you?
I love that answer, but I still feel like it's hard to give them our perspective when we're supposed to be, or when, so like I understand the idea of privilege, and I understand that sometimes when you're operating with persons of privilege, especially when they don't realize that they're operating in a place from privilege, you have to try to either water down a situation or bring it to them in a way that's palatable. And I understand that, but how do you have these kinds of conversations? Especially like, how do you vocalize your fears or your anxieties or your problems or your, just basic conversations on the topic if you're constantly trying to coddle what you say or manipulate it in a way that's palatable? At that point, like, is the message even coming across? I guess would be something that I'm at the point of like struggling with. I actually often host conversations with police departments and high school students just because I mentor groups all the time, and
I love having these conversations, but I always like will tell the police department, like, hey, we're going to ask some serious questions. If you guys can't handle those questions or you're not going to answer, honestly, please just don't come. I'll find a different department. I'll find a different department because like these are going to be questions that I know are going to be tough. And the officers will tell me, well, can you give us your questions first? And I'm like, I would love to do that, but I'm letting my kids ask the questions because you guys are policing them, not me. The community that I live in isn't the community that I have to serve or that I want to serve or that I am serving. So, the police department that handles me treats me very differently from the police department that handles that community or that is in that community. And I tried to find ways to bring that bridge, but for some reason, it always just seems that like when you have these questions of, well, what happened with Breonna Taylor? The first thing that comes out is always, well, I didn't do that. And it's like, okay, we all know that. We all know that. Like, but can you explain to us like what was right and what was wrong? If you're supposed to be this noble police officer, if your job is supposed to be, the arbiter of like kind of getting control of situations and coming into a community or coming into chaos and creating peace, help us understand. Because right now we're all in a state of like fear and trauma and hurt and pain. And if we can't communicate that in a way that's authentic and raw, because we're trying to put at ease your feelings, how do we have those? How do we navigate those spaces like in a genuine way? Because like I've been trying to do it for a long time, and like my students are always like very like they come away closer to the police department, but also very frustrated because they don't feel like they're getting on.
Absolutely. And Megan, I appreciate your passion. Keep that level of passion. And the one thing I'm going to tell you, it's not easy. We're talking about 400 years of oppression. 2022 is not the year that everything gets fixed. And it's hella frustrating as a Black man that I've got to coddle the feelings of white officers for them to understand my position. But when I teach research methods on day one, I don't start talking about multivariate regression models. I've got to get them up to where I need them to be. You need to build levels of trust. One of the things that I do as much as I can when I bring police officers and community members together, I try to give them at least some of the questions because I want them to have really thought out answers. Because a lot of times you ask the police a question, they'll say, let me get back to you on that. I don't want that. I want you to have time to think about and process. That way you can give us real answers. But also understand that people are in fact frustrated. We're not going to fix everything today. And it feels dirty to me that I've got to coddle the feelings of the oppressor. It makes me feel dirty to have to do that. But also I understand that sometimes I've got to get dirty to get to the point where I need to be. Because ultimately I need the police to trust what's going on. And whenever a community group comes to me and says, all right, Lorenzo, we want to talk to the police, I spend about an hour prepping the police first before I bring them in there. And I tell them, folks are pissed off. They're going to yell at you. They're probably going to swear at you. They're going to stick an accusatory finger in your face. Do not react. Let them go. Let them get it out. And invariably, once they get the anger out, then you can get to the real issues. And a lot of officers are like, no, if you're going to yell at me, I'm not going to stay. And I'm telling them, you need to stay. Sit, stay, be part of this. And let's talk through this. Because the community feels like they haven't been heard. They've not had a voice. That's why we have protests. That's why we have riots, because riots are the voice of the voiceless. We need to get this stuff out. And sometimes we have to prep the police ahead of time. If you've got a good relationship, Megan, with the police, help them understand that that's what's going on and help them see the end result. Because for me, going in, I don't like people yelling at me about something that I didn't do. I don't like people, accusing me of stuff. Much in the same way, I don't want the police to look at me and say, okay, well, this dude's wearing a hoodie. He fits the description. I don't want to have to answer for all things Black. So this one officer in whatever town you are shouldn't have to answer to all things policing. And then when we talk to the police about Black lives and they retort with blue lives, I have to caution them. Blue is not a life. Blue is an occupation. You take off your uniform and you can tell everybody you're a dentist or that you're a farmer. We don't have the luxury of pulling off our Blackness. So I try to prep them with these terms. And I tell them, if a community member says Black Lives Matter and you retort Blue Lives Matter, that's kind of like walking into a cancer hospital saying, well, you know, there are other diseases too. That's just not what we're talking about. And part of it is you as a professional, Megan, if you can prep these officers before they go in, that's going to make that go a little easier. It's not going to be easy, but it may be a little bit easier.
Thank you. I'll start seeing what I can do in that respect. Thank you.
And if you've got any questions, you know, I'll put my email address in the chat. If you folks have like real questions and you're going through things and you want to bounce ideas off of me, absolutely reach out. That's why I'm here. Because when one of us succeeds, we all succeed. Other question, how long can we stay? I'm prepared to stay, you know, another 15 or 20 minutes if people have more questions, provided that you guys don't have other stuff to do.
I defer to the group. I'm also happy to stick around. So if there are other questions, please, by all means.
And a lot of people, a lot of officers will say that I'm pro-Black radical. And I was like, you can put a label on it, but my job is to build bridges. And it's really funny when, you know, this blacked out SUV with, you know, the black rims and stuff roll up to a police station with Public Enemy blasting. And then the door opens and Dr. Boyd gets out in this finely fitted suit. They're like, oh, wait, that's not what I thought. Part of my job is to get you to move beyond the stereotypes that you think you should have. And Public Enemy is my go-to for those that are wondering, followed by Ice Cube.
Now
Other
I want
questions for me? And again, you can ask me questions that you don't think are PC, questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking other people. We can make this a safe zone, and there's no question that you can ask me that I wouldn't be willing to respect and answer. You folks are making this way too easy for me.
Okay, well, I have one. I'm happy to lean into the uncomfortable, which I think we have already done a fair bit of. So I also want to appreciate the group for doing that. I've done some thinking about unlearning, particularly when training existing officers, recognizing the way that the training that they receive as new recruits is structured. And so trying to tap into what they have currently learned and reorient that thinking once they are already in the field seems so difficult. But what I've heard from you today, and maybe this is my emotions coming to the fore, that it's not only about unlearning, it's also about healing. And so curious about how that is approached, sort of how the training that you deliver can sometimes often be seen as antithetical to the training that they've received throughout the police academy.
A lot of times that's exactly what they say. When I tell them, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, I'm trying to help you become more efficient. So if you are a carpenter and you have a nail, you have a hammer, you have a drill, I'm introducing a saw. Or I'm introducing a bandsaw. You may decide that whatever the tool I'm giving you, you may not need, but you need to know that this tool exists. And I'm going to tell you the situations where you should use this tool. Because the thing that I tell the police, the training that you get is problematic. It's not worked for 400 years in this country. So maybe instead of reimagining policing, we should actually reimagine training. Because to follow that carpenter scenario, if the only tool you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And if your job is to arrest the bad guy, if you go into this warrior mentality, everybody's the enemy. If you go into more of a guardian mentality, you understand what policing is. So it's trying to reach people individually, trying to reach them where they live. That's why the introspective stuff is so important. Because it's not about you, it's about the individual officer and how you can make your day a little easier, how you can make your job a little easier, how you can make things a little safer for you. Because no officer, I can tell you from experience, wants to walk into a community where everybody hates you and they're calling you names, and the amount of times people called me a sellout when I, rolled into a community. If I can do something to make that community understand who I am and make them like me better, then that's the step forward. And that's where community policing comes in. Because it's hard to hate up close. The more you get to know people, the easier it's going to be. And the police teach you a lot of stuff that you don't need. The vast majority of police officers never fire their weapon in their whole career, the vast majority of officers. But yet, we make them do 80 hours minimum of handgun training, and then every year make them go through an additional 40 hours. So we need to just kind of redesign some of the training so that people understand what's going on. And part of it is what happened with, the protest with George Floyd. The police are starting to look at themselves a little different. Some people are digging their heels in, but there's a whole lot of officers that looked at the George Floyd thing and said, one, that was wrong, and two, that's making our lives so much harder. So right now, we've got an in. We've got a small sliver of a window. And again, we're not going to fix everything all at once. Can we move the needle a little bit? And if each person is moving the needle, if I'm moving the needle a little bit in New England, and in Knoxville, you move the needle, and then in Louisiana, you move the needle. If all of us do a little bit, because I tell every officer that I deal with, I don't need you to save the world. All I'm asking is for you to be the most ethical, moral officer you can be. And to me, that's a starting point that everybody can reach.
And Megan and Stephanie, I think speaking to both of the points that I've heard from you, it's not all about training, right? Training is one solution, but the way I've attempted to structure our sequence of external speakers is recognizing the many different components where change can occur. So there is the issue of recruitment. And I think, Megan, one thing I've heard from you is if those officers in your community are not equipped to actively speak to the concerns, then we might need to reevaluate what that recruitment profile looks like, because that is a huge issue. And then for the training component, if we could reevaluate the entire training ethos to ensure more of what Dr. Boyd is reiterating to these agencies, that is the heart of how the training is structured, then that would also create a different officer upon graduation who is more engaged, more readily equipped to engage with the core audience that they have been tasked to serve. So that's was the larger thinking behind how I put this together. But it's not often that you get an external speaker who can both benefit your intellect around a subject as well as your emotional intellect on something. So really, Dr. Boyd, want to again express my gratitude for bringing your heart and your head to this conversation, because I've found it incredibly valuable.
Thank you. Everybody has a role to play in this. Nobody can afford to sit on the sidelines. And if we want people to do things, a lot of folks have this passive action that they think. What we need is for them to have some affirmative actions moving forward. It's not enough to be non-racist. We need people to become anti-racist. And all of us together have to move that needle. So thank you folks for spending time listening to me. And my apologies for dumping so much in such a little time. And again, my email address is in the chat. If anybody ever wants to drop any thoughts or bounce any ideas off of me, I'm here for you. So thank you so much for spending time listening to me today.
Thanks a million. For those who are celebrating Good Friday, have a happy celebratory weekend. For those observing Passover this evening, may it be meaningful and rewarding. And for those in the midst of Ramadan, may it be a quick fast, and that you break it with friends and family. And thank you all for joining. We'll see you next week, where we'll be joined by Chief Anthony Holloway and Miss Laura Rowe, should she be back from parental leave. And we'll be talking about use of force policies, how those are created, and what a good one might look like. So I'll look forward to seeing you next Friday. Thank you all.
Say hello to Chief Holloway for me, please. He's a good guy.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, folks. Take care.